Should the Jets be looking to draft a quarterback in 2023? You may disagree with me, but I say yes, and I'll tell you why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, February 16th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. Helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. The Jets, of course, are approaching the offseason. We're just about 1 month away from the official beginning of the new league year. And of course, there's going to be activity before that because a couple of days before the official start of the league year, teams are allowed to begin negotiating with free agents. And Derek Carr is available. He's out there, the free agent quarterback, the now free agent quarterback who was released by the Raiders earlier in the week, is available to be signed by a new team at any point. Now, on today's show, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you some unpopular Jets offseason opinions. These are 3 thoughts that I have that kind of go against the conventional wisdom. And the first is dealing with the quarterback position. Now, we know the Jets are going to sign a veteran quarterback. They've told us as much. And it's kind of unusual that a team is so candid about its plans at the quarterback position, because Robert Saleh has even said in public, we are signing a veteran quarterback, and we can presume that that quarterback will be the starting quarterback, that the Jets will not have a camp competition, that Zach Wilson, if he's still here, will be relegated to either second or third string. It makes sense for the Jets to bring in a veteran on a number of levels when we're talking about the fact the team, on paper at least, seems like it's ready to go on a playoff run, go on a run to the playoffs. You know, maybe not go that deep in the playoffs, but this is a team that, if the right circumstances present themselves, could make the playoffs and end what will be, heading into next season, a 13-year drought. On another point, the coaching staff and GM both really need a winning season. They both need to make the playoffs, or they could be out of here in a year. And typically, if you're, there are exceptions. In fact, Mike McCagnon, the last GM, was kind of an exception. But generally speaking, if your job's on the line, you don't want to get a rookie quarterback who's going to have growing pains, presumably. You want to get a quarterback with experience who you know can hit the ground running. And that's what the Jets are going to do. But should the Jets be interested in drafting a quarterback? Now, I'm not sure the Jets are going to draft a quarterback for the reason I just mentioned. This coaching staff and GM, they need to win this year. So I don't know that they necessarily have the luxury of thinking to the future. I think the Jets should be looking to draft a quarterback, though. And why is that? Well, I think the ideal situation to draft a quarterback is when you're not desperate for one. When you've got a veteran starter there who you know can hold down the fort. And maybe he can do it for a year, maybe 2, maybe even 3. And a young quarterback can develop at his own pace. That's the situation you want. You don't want the situation the Jets always find themselves in. Every single time the Jets draft a quarterback in the first round, and even in the case of Geno Smith when they drafted him in the early second round, they're in a spot where the rookie needs to start. I mean, you can go back to Mark Sanchez in 2009. The only alternative was Kellen Clemens, not much of an option. Geno Smith in 2013, early second-round pick. Jets had to put him into the lineup. Now, part of that was Sanchez got hurt, but Sanchez was done anyway. Geno would have played that year, even if Sanchez, I think at least, even if Sanchez had not gotten injured in preseason. 18, Sam Darnold. He was thrust into the lineup. I guess the Jets could have started Teddy Bridgewater, but it was a team that wasn't really going anywhere. The Jets felt desperate for a quarterback. They had pretty much built their entire plan around drafting a quarterback in 18. They weren't sure which one. Sam Darnold had to go into the lineup. And then 21 with Zach Wilson, where there really was no alternative. The Jets, it seems like, intentionally did not bring in any sort of veteran who could possibly compete with Zach Wilson. He was handed the starting job. That's not how you do it. Now, what you want is a situation like the Seattle Seahawks found themselves back in 2012, where they brought in a veteran quarterback in Matt Flynn, and the whole plan was for him to start. Then that year, they drafted Russell Wilson in the third round. Wilson then stepped into the lineup, and the reason he took the starting job was he was just further along than anybody thought he'd be. See, it's good when the quarterback surprises you. You want a situation where the quarterback goes out and earns the starting job. And if he does that, then you're perfectly happy to have him as your starting quarterback. It's not that no rookie is capable of starting. It's that you don't want to put yourself in a position where the rookie has to start. If he goes out there and earns the job in his own right and surprises you, that's great. But beyond that, I think the Jets need to get a veteran quarterback for another fundamental reason, is that any veteran they bring in is not going to be here for 10 years. They do need to think of the future, and I think even if they brought in a Derek Carr, he probably would be a medium-term option. I think you're talking about a 3 to 4 to 5 year guy. And if you brought in a young quarterback, if you drafted somebody, it probably would be on the shorter end. You might be talking 3 years or so. You want to have somebody developing for the future. You want somebody who can step into the lineup. And there's also more practical point here is injuries do happen in the NFL. You want a good backup. I'm not sure any team is drafting a backup quarterback in the first round, although I question whether maybe that's not such a good idea. But it also helps when you have a backup who can step into the lineup. And you may find yourself in a situation if you bring in a veteran and you draft somebody early where the starter gets hurt, the veteran starter gets hurt, the young backup steps into the lineup and never gives the job back. That's another situation that could present itself. But ultimately, you have to view this offseason through two lenses, I think. You have to view it in the short run where you need to fix the quarterback position immediately. You need somebody who can step right in, hit the ground running, run this offense effectively. And with the talent you have on the defensive side of the ball, you might be able to go to the playoffs this year. But you also have to have the long-term view. And you have to understand that really anybody you get is probably not going to be the quarterback of the Jets' next Super Bowl team. It's more of a bridge situation where if this player is effective over the next couple of years, the Jets can build their roster up, and the quarterback who they draft can then take over and maybe take the team to the next level. And that was the way Kansas City did it. It's a team I frequently talk about because, to me, that's the best path forward for a team trying to build around a quarterback. When they got Alex Smith, who bought them more than anything the luxury of time, because he played effectively enough for the team to win games. They could not ultimately win a Super Bowl with Alex Smith, however. But because they had Alex Smith, they were able to build a degree of stability, and they were able to wait for the perfect quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, to come to them, and then they went out and got Patrick Mahomes. They were able to sit Mahomes that first year so that Mahomes was not rushed into the lineup. He was not put under undue pressure. And then eventually Patrick Mahomes took over, and of course the Kansas City Chiefs have 2 Super Bowls and counting. That's a good way to develop a quarterback. It's not to put him on these terrible rosters that like the Jets have done with all their young quarterbacks through the years. And I will say this, at least the Jets roster is a little bit better now than it's been in the past. At least you have some pieces. You have, especially on the offensive side of the ball, where you got Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, but you still don't want to be in a situation where you have to start a rookie. You want to be in a situation where if the rookie wows you, he can step into the lineup. And another thing I want to make clear here is that I'm not saying the Jets need to draft a quarterback. The right guy has to be there when you're drafting. It has to be the right situation, or he has to be within shouting distance of where you can trade up. And I'm not saying they have to draft somebody in the first round. I'm not saying they have to draft somebody in the second round. I'm not saying they have to draft somebody in the third round. What I'm saying is that they should not be opposed to it, because I think a lot of people are viewing this as there's no way the Jets should draft a quarterback this year. That I don't agree with. I think that if the value is there, if it's the right spot and it's the right player, the Jets should be looking to draft a quarterback, because they have to think about their future. They have to think about their present too, I understand. But this next quarterback the Jets sign is not going to be here for the long run. So they need to think beyond that. And they have an opportunity now, if they get a veteran, to bring a young quarterback along at his own pace. And he'll be ready to step in when he's ready, not when the Jets need him to be there. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk more about some unpopular Jets offseason opinions I have. One's about the defensive side of the ball. The Jets defense is fine, right? Well, it might be fine, but I still think it could use some upgrades, and I'll explain what I mean as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and calories? Then you've got to try a Built Bar. We're approaching free agency. The Jets are going to try and go get the best players they can find. Well, if you want the best food you can find, you got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious you won't know they're good for you. And what makes these bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors. You got churro, you got peanut butter brownie, you got coconut almond. And I'm not sure how Built does it, but they make these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is that they're healthy. They're only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein on most bars. And now you don't need to wait for a box. You have to wait another month for Jets free agency, so why don't you spend your time by enjoying some Built bars? For years we've been talking about ordering Built bars at Built.com. Well, now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right, head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later. And of course, you can still order Built bars at Built.com. No matter how you get your Built bars, you're going to love them. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This show's free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. We're talking Jets' unpopular offseason opinions. So I'm not going to be Mr. Popularity today. I'm giving you some opinions that you're probably going to disagree with. I've talked about why the Jets should be looking to draft a quarterback this year in the first segment. Now I'm going to talk about the defense, because I think there are a lot of people who say don't address the defense at all this offseason. I mean, it's not so much that as it is the Jets have a limited number of resources. So I think the focus is more on the resources should be focused on fixing the offense. And I think that's a fair point. I think if we're talking priorities, the offense comes in before the defense. And hopefully the quarterback situation, by bringing in a veteran who can provide stability, hopefully that goes a long way towards fixing things. But I think you always have to be nimble. You always have to look at the possibilities in front of you, because when you approach the NFL offseason, the perfect player that you need is not always there. Sometimes he's there in free agency, sometimes he's there in the draft, but you can't always address the position because the guy you need isn't always available. And I think especially looking at free agency this year, this does not look like a particularly great free agent class to me. I really struggled to come up with players who I have a ton of interest in, at least at high priority positions for the Jets, at least once we get past the big names like an Orlando Brown at tackle. So while the Jets certainly need to address quarterback, and I think they've got to try and figure out something on the offensive line, the best opportunity, it's possible, and a lot of this will depend on how the draft falls, because you never know. When you're picking at 13, if the Jets stay there, the best player for them might be on the defensive side of the ball. And I think there are a couple of areas on defense the Jets could stand to improve. Now, if you're going to tell me the Jets should not even consider bringing in a corner or spending any major resources on a corner, I'll agree with you. They cannot upgrade that position. I mean, it's impossible to upgrade what the Jets have at corner. I guess if you brought in, in his prime, Darrelle Revis, you'd upgrade it, but with Sauce Gardner on one corner and DJ Reed on the other, and then you got Michael Carter II on the inside, it really would not make sense for the Jets to use big resources at corner. Now, if you want to draft somebody day 3 as a developmental guy, you work on him to maybe take over for DJ Reed in a couple of years when Reed's contract expires, that's one thing. If you're looking for depth, you could always use extra depth, even though I think the Jets are actually pretty deep at the corner position when you've got two guys with legitimate starting experience in Bryce Hall and Brandon Echols. But if you're looking for depth, day 3 pick, cheap free agent, that's fine. Okay, don't touch corner. I think everywhere else, though, you could justify a move. Some people may say no to the defensive line, but if you could get a premium edge rusher, and I don't know if there was one could be one available. And again, I'm not saying the Jets need to do this, but I'm saying I'm open to the possibility. I think a lot of people are close to the possibility of maybe using the first round pick on defense. Well, if there's a premium edge rusher available, you got to look at it, because on the defensive line, there's really only one superstar level player, and that's Quinnen Williams. And if you could add a second guy there, a second star level talent to that line, on top of all the supporting cast you've got, where you've got John Franklin Myers, and you've got Jermaine Johnson hopefully stepping up, and we don't know what's going to happen with Carl Lawson, but Bryce Huff. There's plenty of talent on this defensive line, but there's only one premium player. And I think you kind of saw it last year. The game Quinnen Williams missed against the Detroit Lions, even though the defense played well on paper, there was a big difference without Quinnen Williams in the lineup. The Jets really missed something on the defensive line in that game, even though they on paper it looked good, the stats looked okay, the point total wasn't that big, but it just was not the same defense in that game. And I think you always should be looking to stack talent. I think that too much of the focus in the offseason is typically around just improving areas where you're weak. You also have to consider building on strengths, taking that defensive line to the next level, because although the Jets' defensive line is good, it could be great if they add one more player, because then you get to a situation where you've either got Quinnen Williams or the guy you drafted getting one-on-one on every play. One of the two guys is going to be one-on-one on every single play. That's something you're looking for. But I think bigger focus, if we're going to be honest, is linebacker and safety. I think the one thing this defense is missing is that guy who just flies around the field in the middle and makes plays. And it can be a linebacker, it can be a safety. Jamal Adams, ironically, if you added like a Jamal Adams, or at least a Jets version of Jamal Adams, where he was playing at an all-pro level, to this defense, this might be, this could be a top 3 defense. And that's really what they're lacking. I think that they get exposed in the middle of the field. They don't really cover that well. They don't have guys who can play man-on-man against tight ends or running backs. And, the linebackers are also shaky. And I think this is true of the safeties as well, so I should not single out the linebackers. But you see a lot of times these guys are filling the wrong gaps, and they're allowing good runs to go against them because guys aren't executing their assignments well. I think you also have a speed issue. CJ Mosley is just not built to play in the system. I think CJ Mosley is better built for the system the Jets ran when they signed him under Greg Williams. This scheme, which asks linebackers to cover a lot of ground to go sideline to sideline, despite even the Pro Bowl and All-Pro berths from CJ Mosley, it's just not in his skill set, and I just don't think he's the player he was in Baltimore. So if you can add that type of player, whether it's a safety, whether it's a linebacker, a playmaker, a guy who can cover a lot of ground, that's the one thing I think this defense is lacking, especially that guy, and there aren't many of them in the NFL, but especially that guy, if you can find somebody who matches up against tight ends and running backs, that would really take this Jets defense to the next level. And I understand, people say it's an offensive league. Listen, if you have a great defense, it helps your team an awful lot. There's, if offense is important, then the ability to stop offense better than other teams is also very important. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out our Thursday show, and I'll give you one more unpopular opinion. It's about a position that I don't love. It's the tight end position. Jets may have used a lot of resources to build their tight end room. I still think they should be focused this offseason on improving it, and I'll explain why as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the midway point of the NBA season, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because now customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bet back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained. As I told you, I would not bet on Jets tight ends, but the NFL season's over, so you can focus on basketball now. And FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at an even bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook betting partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking Jets' unpopular offseason opinions. I'm going to give you one more. I've talked quarterbacks, I've talked defense. The Jets should absolutely be looking to upgrade their tight end room this year. And people disagree with this mainly because the Jets used a lot of resources at tight end last year because they gave moderate, I shouldn't say huge contracts, but fairly big contracts to C.J. Uzomah and Tyler Conklin, and then they used a day 3 pick on Jeremy Ruckert. Well, I'm here to tell you that if the best reason you have for not addressing position is that you just use a lot of resources on it last year, I don't know that's a great reason, because Jets tight ends were not good last year. In fact, Jets tight ends were awful last year. The Jets used all these resources to upgrade their tight end room and pretty much did not improve their roster at all. It's really tough to do, especially when you're going from guys like Ryan Griffin and Wesco and Tyler Kroft. But that's what the Jets did. And I understand, like, people laugh when I talk about Jets tight ends because it's been like one of the running gags on the show over the last couple of years. My frustration with Jets tight ends, my frustration with Ryan Griffin. Well, I'm just as frustrated now because these guys were terrible. The Jets paid a lot more money for guys who just brought nothing to the table. Tyler Conklin essentially was a guy who was a drop machine, a guy who really struggled blocking, a guy who was great if you wanted a third down check down that got tackled 5 yards short of the sticks. Uzomah did not bring much to the table. Now, Jeremy Ruckert's a different story. This was clearly supposed to be a redshirt year for Jeremy Ruckert. This was not a year, especially if you bring in two guys at your position in free agency, but also a late third-round pick. Despite what people think, you usually don't get much production from them. Once you get to the third round, it's very rare that you have a guy who plays a prominent role for your team. And even when he's playing, even the few who play prominent roles, most of them really aren't very good as rookies. If you're going in the late third round, you're usually not ready to play. If you were ready to play, you'd go higher. You'd go in the first or second round. So I don't want to get too hard on Jeremy Ruckert, but the fact of the matter is that the position, the spot of the draft he was taken at is a spot where, there's maybe like a 1 in 5 shot at getting a role player. So I don't want to overstate how good the chances are that Ruckert develops into a player for the Jets. But even if he does, listen, we know Conklin and Uzomah are probably not long-term players with this team. And, one of the things that drives me crazy is people talk about Tyler Conklin's stat line as though, like, half of his production wasn't in garbage time or, completely meaningless catches on third down where he was tackled short of the sticks. I mean, I think there's a lot of box score focus on Conklin, not on his actual level of effectiveness, which is not very good. And Uzomah, there's less debate about him. I think people just realize he did not bring a whole lot to the table. Now, will things change with Nathaniel Hackett? Well, if anything, Nathaniel Hackett may use them more because Nathaniel Hackett used tight ends as much as any team in the league last year, especially on first down. And he also used his tight ends in the slot quite a bit, which is not something Mike LaFleur did. So you want guys who can bring actual receiving skills to the table. And this is supposed to be a pretty good draft when we're talking about receiving tight ends. So I look at the situation. I can't get over when people say the Jets should not look to address tight end because they have all this money tied up. Well, they have a lot of money tied up in the position, but they don't have very good play. Now, I can understand if you want to say we should prioritize other areas. But again, what I'm saying here, and really this is true of all three arguments I'm making, I'm not saying the Jets absolutely need to do this, but I'm saying that the people who are acting as though these should be off the table are incorrect. Because, the Jets aren't going to be able to do everything. They're not going to be able to add a young quarterback and add a star defensive lineman and add a linebacker and add a safety and add a tight end. There's just not enough resources to do all these things. But I think a lot of people have taken these ideas off the table. But part of the offseason is you need to adjust and you need to view both free agents and draft prospects not through what you wish was out there, but in the context of what's actually out there. And sometimes the thing that improves your team most is not the area of biggest weakness for your football team. Sometimes you just have to accept that your biggest need's not something you can address, so you have to build your team another way. You have to improve another area of your roster. So these are three areas. I know it's not popular. I know a lot of people will disagree, but I think Jets should definitely be interested in drafting a quarterback. They should be open to upgrading their defense, even though it's very good. And tight end, my goodness, maybe one day the Jets will get a tight end that can actually play. That's my hope. I don't really think it's realistic, unfortunately, because the Jets have just put out nothing at the tight end position from year to year. But who knows? Maybe the Jets will get one day the Jets will actually get a tight end who can actually play. Very aspirational of me. It's a very optimistic way to end our show. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.